Recently, I had the pleasure of watching The Cheat from 1915. Starring actress Fanny Ward and actor Sessue Hayakawa, The Cheat is, in essence, a rape fantasy. The hour-long silent film follows socialite Edith Hardy, played by Ward, as she struggles to get her shopping problem under control. We are meant to feel sorry for her as her white husband Richard, played by Jack Dean, begs her to stop buying expensive things until his investment pays off, but she insists that she needs a new dress for the upcoming Red Cross ball, for which she's a treasurer of. Throughout this first third of the film, she periodically spends time with the Burmese ivory trader Haka Arakawa, played by Hayakawa. At the Red Cross ball, Edith accidentally loses $10,000 meant for the Red Cross and turns to Haka for help. He agrees to lend her money in exchange for sex in the future. Edith ends up getting more money from Richard and brings it to Haka, attempting to buy him off. But, he says, "You cannot buy me off." This leads to the infamous scene where Edith tries to escape, but Haka grabs her and brands her with the iron that he previously showed her, explaining, "That means it belongs to me." Fast-forwarding through the rest of the film, Edith shoots Haka, not fatally. She escapes, Richard comes and is caught with a gun by the police, and then everyone goes to court. Richard takes the fall for Edith, but when the verdict deems him guilty, Edith runs to the judge and pleads her case, revealing that she was the one that shot Haka. Richard is then declared to be a free man, and Edith and Richard walk out hand in hand. So let's discuss the pros and cons of this movie. Starting with the pros, Sessue Hayakawa, an Asian man, is clearly the standout in this film. Over a century later, Hayakawa's performance is the only one that really holds up. Edith appears to be overly histrionic, throwing her hands up and jerking around wildly in typical silent movie fashion. But even back when the movie came out, Variety magazine called him one of the best yellow heavies that the screen has ever had, and said, "The work of Sessue Hayakawa is so far above the acting of Miss Ward and Jack Dean that he really should be the star in the billing for the film." In an interview with Cecil B. DeMille, the director, he says, "I do not teach actors how to act. I direct them. I do not show them. The whole performance is from them. I direct their talent. I instruct them to play the part as they would play it. In that way, you don't get 20 little Cecil DeMilles running around the stage. You get the individual personalities of each actor, and that's probably why I've made so many stars." To provide some historical context, Hayakawa is accepted to be the first American heartthrob. Rudolph Valentino is often the face that comes to mind when thinking of silent film era sex symbols, but he actually wouldn't come along for another decade. So right off the bat, we have Hayakawa subverting traditional expectations and making history. Hayakawa's study room is decorated with Asiatic items: ivory figurines, Buddha statues, a painting of a Japanese god, trees with petals resembling cherry blossoms, and so on. Even his branding iron is an image of a Japanese temple gate, called a torii, so the designers paid attention to detail. This can be seen as cultural appreciation. The fun part about silent films is that you can imagine what the characters are saying. This isn't a win for The Cheat so much as it is for silent pictures in general in the early 20th century, so half a point for this, I guess. The cinematography was pretty good. The version that I watched on YouTube is rather fuzzy and some sections are overexposed, but the shadows in the shooting scene in particular looked pretty good, and the chiaroscuro portraits are appealing to look at. Moving on to the cons, we've got racism. To unwrap this a bit, let's start with the music. Though silent films did not typically have a score specifically composed for the movie, the version of The Cheat that I watched had an accompanying soundtrack that was definitely intentionally used. That is, nearly every time that Haka appears on screen, we are notified by an oriental flourish. It's honestly impressive how subtly and not so subtly racist this movie is, even though it's silent. The only Asian characters in The Cheat are Hayakawa and his servants. In court, one of his workers says, "When I grab that man, he have this gun." This broken English is such a classic, timeless way to make fun of Asians with accents. When The Cheat was initially released in 1915, Hayakawa's character was named Hishiro Tori and was Japanese. But during the 1918 re-release, they rebranded him to Haka Arakawa, a Burmese man. At this point, the US was allied with Japan in World War I, so the idea was that since Haka is a villain, rather than putting Japanese people in a bad light, they would make Burmese people look bad. The reasoning: number 1, nobody knows where Burma is, and number 2, all Asian people look similar enough, so swapping out ethnicities is fine. During the time of The Cheat's release in the early 1900s, Asian men weren't really a part of mainstream pop culture. Representations of them were quite narrow, and they were often a sidebar, the butt of racist jokes. Fu Manchu, the evil genius who is essentially a Yellow Peril ripoff of Sherlock Holmes, was created in 1913, so he was the prevailing Asian character in American media. Charlie Chan, another stereotype, but a more positive one, didn't come along until Earl Bigger's novel in 1923. In the modern world, Asian men are emasculated and desexualized, relegated to undesirable nerds who have no business dating women, least of all white women. See Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's, and the horribly named Long Duck Dong in 16 Candles.
What's your name?
Dong.
What's your first name?
Long.
Contrastingly, Haka is initially presented as this classy, desirable man, at least until he devolves into a creepy predator. Going back to DeMille saying he does not teach actors how to act, it's as if he had to compensate for Hayakawa's greatness by making his character a horrible person. The movie seems as if it's on a trajectory for Haka and Edith to end up together. They are both part of high society, they both have a tendency to buy unnecessary things, they are closer in age than Edith and Richard are. Haka is not constantly at work counting ticker tape, and overall he seems to be an upstanding, chivalrous man. But while this desirableness starts off as being attractive, it quickly becomes dangerous and wrong. Because the movie doesn't work if it portrays Haka as the hero. That would be too progressive. Additionally, the idea of women using their sexuality for their own benefit was radical and controversial, so the film diverts your attention from Edith's role in the money exchange and places all of the blame on Haka. When Edith faints and Haka assaults her, we see him transform into a darker, chilling, foreign man. Atlas Obscura writer Rachel King says it best. The possibility that an Asian man might be a more appealing sex partner for a white Long Island matron than her middle-aged Caucasian husband was too transgressive a notion for DeMille to fully commit to. He has Hayakawa, after spending much of the film chastely escorting Ward's vapid socialite around, metamorphose rather abruptly into a sadistic rapist. As an extension of the previous con, The Cheat falls victim to the idea that men of color are a menace to white women. The Cheat was groundbreaking as it depicts an interracial relationship, or at least the beginnings of one, during a time of anti-miscegenation laws. Though the laws explicitly referred to black and white relationships, in practice they extended to Asians as well. However, any progressiveness in this movie is ruined by Hayakawa's violence and the ending that asserts that Richard is the man for Edith. This motif of the person of color constantly losing the woman to the white man is repeated throughout so many films, including many of Hayakawa's other movies. Furthermore, The Cheat presents Asian men, and people of color more broadly, as out to harm white women, while Richard, the white man, is the gallant protector, the savior of white women. Even in court, when Richard was the one accused of shooting Haka, people were fine with letting him go to jail, but as soon as it was revealed that Edith was the victim and the shooter, the crowd went wild. The observers surge up in an attempt to lynch Haka. And the thing is, this idea that white women are so vulnerable to non-white men has incredibly dangerous, real-life implications. Going on a slight tangent here, The Cheat came out in the same year as the KKK propaganda The Birth of a Nation, which also features the saving white women trope. While The Cheat seems like a pro-equality movie in comparison, the slightly more subtle racism is horrible in another way. People were invigorated by The Cheat, and reportedly, audiences shouted in support of the mob attempting to lynch Haka at the end of the movie. A reporter from Moving Picture wrote, "One of the men that sat behind me in the Strand Theater said, 'I would like to be in that mob.'" That is so scary. The cheat launched Hayakawa into fame and status as a sex symbol, as he was exoticized and fetishized. Sometimes called forbidden fruit, Hayakawa's fan base was mainly young white women who, quote, swooned over the taboo romance he represented. Even more explicitly so, screenwriter DeWitt Bodine said, Hayakawa's appeal involved fiercer tones of masochism as well as a latent female urge to experience sex with a beautiful but savage man of another race. Ew, but also he's not wrong. Much like modern obsessions with bad boys, there's a market for men that don't belong with women. This is literally written out in the film, injected by a weird intertitle that proclaims, East is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. People always want what they're told they can't or shouldn't have. Allegedly, when the 1915 version of the film was released, a Japanese noodle shop owner was lynched coming out of the theater. However, I was only able to find one account of this attack by the newspaper Rafu Shimpo. But regardless, it is reasonable to assume that some level of anti-Asian violence and ridicule was sparked by the cheat. As that moviegoer who commented on wanting to join the lynching scene demonstrates, what happens on screen is often a reflection or prediction of the real world. I'm not saying that movies are the reason that Emmett Till and Vincent Chin were lynched, but there is an undeniable relationship between racism on screen and in real life. After all, many of Hayakawa's movies, including The Cheat, were banned in Japan. Hayakawa even apologized for his involvement and told an interviewer in 1916 that such roles are not true to our Japanese nature. They are false and give people the wrong idea of us. So why did Hayakawa take all these racist roles? I'd say it boils down to commodification being better than invisibility. In a time when roles for characters of color were consistently being passed over to white people, in fact, this trend of white casting later contributed to the downfall of Hayakawa's career, people of color took what they could get. In Bell Hook's 1992 essay, Eating the Other, Desire and Resistance, she says, concurrently, marginalized groups, deemed other, who have been ignored, rendered invisible, can be seduced by the emphasis on otherness, by its commodification, because it offers the promise of recognition and reconciliation. In other words, under the guise of appreciation and false promises of equality, Asian people had to settle for at least being seen. Desirability and even ridicule can be seen as being better than invisibility, so that's what Hayakawa worked towards. Hayakawa did not find success in all of his roles. His first talkie was a Fu Manchu story called Daughter of the Dragon, and after audiences heard his Japanese accent, his popularity nosedived. And while he is not quite a household name today, he broke boundaries by entering a white-dominated profession and even created his own production company. And though The Cheat is riddled with racism, hopefully his role encouraged young people of color to push further.